Hi, everybody. This is Howard Chao at Dune Insights. I'm going to be interviewing a couple of partners from Sidley, who will be at our Auto Mobility Tech event in Bonnie Doon later this month. And the subject will be the state of the markets and financing for auto mobility tech. And with me today, I have Andrew Harper and Justin Savage of Sidley, both partners at that firm. And I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves. So, Andrew, what do you do and what are you about?
Thanks, Howard. I'm about a lot, but in this space, I'm a startup and venture capital lawyer. I represent companies and investors across the whole ecosystem. On the company side, I represent founders and venture-backed companies at all stages, doing a lot of venture financings and other transactions. And then I also represent investors investing in these types of companies. So that's traditional financial VCs, corporate venture funds and strategic investors, sovereign wealth funds, family offices, some private equity funds. So I am deep in the startup ecosystem, and I see transactions constantly and from all different perspectives. I'm also part of Sidley's Auto and Mobility industry group, and I focus a large part of my practice just on helping companies and investors in the auto and mobility spaces. So I work with companies, VCs, OEMs in the space, and Sidley as a firm, we're a 2,000 lawyer global firm with 25 offices around the globe and lots of specialty practices that help support auto and mobility clients. And so we are kind of uniquely situated in this space to see a broad array of things that impact startups and investors in the auto and mobility space. So that's what I'm about. Now I'll kick it over to you, Justin.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Howard, for having me on the podcast. So I'm a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Sidley, and I really wear two hats. One, I lead globally our auto mobility group, where I work a lot closely with Andrew. It's exciting to see the energy and new ideas that could transform society coming out of the Valley, the area where you are. And I also wear another hat. I co-lead our global environmental and safety team. And there also is another touch point with Andrew and other tech leaders such as yourself, because there is a huge driver due to climate change and ESG for investment, and then on the backside, risk management for those. On a personal note, I'm a huge Washington Nationals fan, so I'm quite sad, but I've decided still to do this podcast. Thanks.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Well, so this discussion is going to be about a lot of different things. We have too much to cover in too short a period of time. But in general, let me just introduce by saying that, the world has suffered a whole series of shocks to our system, and to this industry. And part of what we should talk about today is what are the shocks that are affecting the overall marketplace and what are affecting just this industry, both positive and negative in some cases. So, obviously we've been through a couple of years of dramatic change, even before COVID, even before the trade war with China. We were seeing an incipient disruption of the auto mobility industry, right? We knew that electrification was coming. We knew that the climate change was coming and that we were going to have to decarbonize. And so that was already happening. We knew that, there are going to be a lot of companies that are going to be facing a Kodak moment. And it's not just one or two companies, right? And then we had a trade war with China, which is obviously a key player in the supply chain for this whole industry. And then we had COVID that hit. And then we had the Ukraine war that hit, was affecting the energy system as a whole globally. And then we had inflation. And now we have huge volatility in the marketplace because of all these things that are happening, right? And so we could say that, things are pretty negative for the global economy as a whole. I mean, people are predicting a recession next year globally. And we could say that this is going to affect, and certainly it's affecting financing markets as a whole. But on the other hand, there are some countervailing trends and factors for this industry that may be a little bit different from other industries. So that's what I'd like to get into a little bit here today with the two of you. So let me start by asking Andrew, how bad and how volatile are things? I mean, we went through a period of time where everything was a little bit too euphoric, right? And we had the SPAC craze. We had the valuations of startups and companies that, especially in tech, that were just unexpected during a pandemic. And now we're kind of on the flip side of that. So what's the general sense of the market, Andrew?
Yeah, so that's a great background, Howard, and good backdrop for some data and some more specifics. You know, as startup lawyers, and when we sit at the kind of epicenter of a lot of transactions, we track deals pretty closely and macro movements, both broadly in the VC space and in auto and mobility. And I would say, well, we'll run through some data just to kind of give some context to what we're talking about. But I think the headline is that, to your point, Howard, you know, a lot of these numbers, when you talk about year over year, quarter over quarter, I think it's important to think about them more broadly, because the recent past was so euphoric, as you said, and irrational by some standards and some people's opinions. So I would just keep that in the back of our mind as we run through a couple of numbers. So, and again, when reporting on this type of space, there's always going to be some inaccuracy because most of these deals are private transactions. Reporting can be sparse, and so just take things with a grain of salt. But I think there's still useful data to run through. So let's just talk first about the macro climate and VC generally. So Q3 2022 numbers are recently in and released, and deal value is down year over year by 90 billion and that's down 53% year over year. Quarter over quarter, we're down 33%. And this past quarter is actually the lowest quarterly funding amount since the first quarter of 2020, with 70.6 billion in venture funding. Now, these numbers sound a bit alarming, I know, but I would note to my point earlier that these numbers are still up generally from 2019 and early 2020 pre-pandemic levels. So this number, the quarter over quarter, is actually up 15% from that Q1 2020 number that I just cited. So still historically trending in a decent direction, just down from the euphoric levels that we saw over the last year and a half.
All right.
Deal count, actual number of deals getting done, year over year is down 11%, quarter over quarter, 10%. And it's down almost 20% from the quarterly record high we saw in Q1 of this year. But again, that was a little bit unrealistic and not sustainable. So this is still up about 20% from 2019, early 2020 pre-pandemic levels. So historically, not all that bad. And these numbers, I think a lot of people would say represent kind of a healthy market correction. Is definitely not a complete winter. Plenty of deals are still getting done, thousands of deals per quarter. So I think while the headline percentage droppages might seem drastic, it's actually not as bad as it seems, and some people think it may be actually reaching healthy and sustainable levels.
And Andrew, do you see a differential between early and late stage deal flows?
Definitely. I think the late stage, early stage is Series A and B and earlier. They're actually faring decently well. It's the mid and late stage stuff that's seeing more challenges. And I think that makes sense because when you look at what's happening in the public markets, later stage company are closer to those types of companies, and investors have to take those into account when they're thinking about valuations and funding. And so it's just making it harder for companies to come to terms on those types of deals, and fewer of those deals are getting done. And then just in terms of velocity of deals. They're taking longer, and investors are taking their time. They're focusing on fundamentals more. They're focusing on diligence. And so that's shown more, I think, in the later stage stuff, that over the last year and a half was moving really quickly, and those deals are just taking longer to get done. At the earlier stages, there's just not as much of that to do, so it doesn't impact those types of transactions as much.
Right. So Andrew, talk to us a little bit about valuations too. So what are you seeing in terms of how worse the valuations have become at these different stages? I mean, obviously SPACs are not being done, public market valuations are way down. So how does that filter down to these different stages of startups?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty interesting. And when we talk about valuations, I would caveat this conversation with that it's not always the best metric to look at, because especially now, there are a lot of things that go into valuations, and then there are also a lot of things that companies can do to avoid setting a valuation that may not show up when you look just at the raw data. So for example, a lot of companies right now may not be able to get the valuation they want, so they're doing bridge rounds, or they're getting alternative funding through debt or other avenues. So while their real valuation probably has come down, you're not going to see that in the data because they're not doing a transaction at that value.
Yeah.
So, but with that said, there are still plenty of deals reported, and it's worth talking about. And so for the pre-seed and seed and early stage deals, surprisingly, they're all still trending up in 2022. Very surprising number. But again, this could be for a number of reasons, like deals that would otherwise be at lower valuations are not happening because companies are bridging. I know that in my practice, I see this a lot. A lot of companies are doing bridge rounds, hoping to weather the storm without setting a new lower valuation. And a lot of investors are being really supportive of companies and willing to bridge them on reasonable terms. So this is the number is surprising and maybe suspiciously rosy, but what is clear is that in the late stage financing, Series C and later, that these valuations are down 14% from 2022. And this is, again, this is now down to an average of a $582 million valuation, which historically is still high. That's up 150% or 1.5x from 2020 pre-pandemic levels. So it's again concerning drop, but when you put it in the historical context, again, it might be not the worst thing for the market to come down to something that's more sustainable.
Let me invite Justin to jump in here too. What are you seeing similar trends in your practice, Justin?
No, I think we're seeing some tailwinds instead of headwinds, and there's some regulatory and legislative initiatives that are really pushing climate change tech and solutions. I mean, I just spent a week in Houston and talking to our leadership there, Kevin Lewis or Rotter. There's 8 active carbon capture and storage deals and projects. But then from a bigger picture, people are in a race to be a to address climate change. I think there are going to be a lot of climate change unicorns. There's ESG pressure on companies. And then if you look at the legal framework in the US, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which we might chat a little bit about later. But then even look at Europe, they're going to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. We're going to essentially impose tariffs based on the carbon intensity of your products. So I think from my practice, we are seeing a lot of inflow of work. I mean, I think we got hired on Friday alone for 3 Inflation Reduction Act engagements on how to advise, startups, venture capital, corporate, public companies, just on how they position themselves, given all of these drivers to address climate change and ESG.
Right. So that's a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, which is, you have these macro trends that affect the market as a whole, and then you have some individual trends for the auto and mobility sector that may be countervailing to that, right? So that's something I'd like to get into a little bit more later. But so coming back to you, Andrew, so tell us about down rounds. Are you seeing a lot of down rounds despite the effort to avoid them?
So down rounds are, I think, in some ways, even a better indicator of what's happening in the market than valuations are, because you're comparing a company to itself and saying, what did it do in its prior funding? And so just to be clear, what we're talking about with a down round, we're talking about a priced equity financing where the price per share of the new shares is lower than what the company issued previously. So we're not talking about convertible notes that may have valuation caps and things like that. We're really just talking about real rounds. And that data is actually easy to pick up from publicly filed charters. So again, there are definitely more down rounds happening, but again, not as many as we would expect for the reasons I mentioned before. Companies, number one, can game this and do financings at a certain price and offer things like warrants separately that effectively would bring the price down. But I don't think that's a huge chunk of deals. But I think the biggest reason really is bridging and companies getting alternative funding. So investors, like I said before, are being super supportive and bridging companies to get through these hard times. And also venture debt has seen an uptick and just typical traditional credit facilities. I would say though, we'll see over the next 12 to 18 months, because as these bridge rounds,
right? It's early. I mean, we're early in this recession, assuming it's a recession, right? So who knows what's going to happen in 6 or 12 months?
Exactly. I didn't say the R word, but you did. But it's gonna be clear, I think, as over the next 12 to 18 months, as companies start to come up on the end of their runway after a bridge round. Then what happens?
Yeah.
Or I think if the market has not recovered, if the broader market is still suffering the pains we've discussed, then I think you're going to see a lot of those companies having to do down rounds. And so I unfortunately expect to see more of them coming.
On the flip side of that, though, is that you see these articles out in the press about how, people have done this analysis that many funds raised a lot of money in the last couple of years, and their investment period is going to come to a term in the next 2 or 3 years, right? And so they've got to either put that money out or not invest it, and so they're incentivized to invest. And so that may be a countervailing factor in some of these fundings.
For sure. And I think there's been a record number or a record amount of venture capital raised and funds raised for actual VC funds. And there's a record amount of dry powder in the market today. I think, there are reasons to be optimistic with that in mind, but I think people should be cautious and not overstate the effect that'll have, because investors, a lot of these funds are new and very early in their life cycle, and investors can oftentimes afford to be patient.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they're just going to go on spending sprees necessarily. So we saw this over the summer. In the past 3 to 6 months, there are a lot of top tier investors that just sat on the sidelines.
Yeah.
Some investors didn't cut term sheets for months, and so that was we see that firsthand. And so I think it's definitely reason for some optimism, the amount of dry powder out there, but I would just temper that excitement.
Okay, so let's turn to this factors that are more specific to the automobility sector, right? Because despite all this gloom and doom and volatility within the markets generally, there are things about the automobility sector that are unique to it, which may be positive or it may cause a lot of deals to happen. I mean, we've talked about them already, some of these, whether it's climate change, electrification, but in particular, legislation. The government has pushed forward this Inflation Reduction Act, and it has specific benefits to this industry. And so maybe Chris, you can Justin, you can summarize what the act does and what benefits it brings.
So, sorry, before you jump in, Justin,
Yeah.
I would just add a note that, the auto and mobility space, the numbers I was talking about before were the entire VC market, and the auto and mobility VC trends more or less track the broader market numbers that I was describing before. But I think, Howard, what you're alluding to is the fact that from here on out, I think there are different reasons for concern and optimism in this space.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those reasons for optimism is exactly what Justin's going to talk about. I think there's a lot of excitement globally about this space, and more opportunities for companies to get funded outside of traditional VC. So I just think there's important contexts. But I'll kick it over to you, Justin. Go for it.
Thanks, Andrew. And if you were going to put a high-level headline on continued investment in the automobility space, it's FOMO, fear of missing out. So if you've never been to it, please go to the Peterson Auto Museum in Los Angeles. I think it was founded by the family that founded Hot Rod Magazine, and they have different historical epochs within the auto sector. At the beginning of the turn of the century, Paris was the auto center of the capital. They actually had EVs back then. They're ginormous batteries. After World War II was the second revolutionary time because there was a war and so there were new market entrants. We're in that third space where there's new technologies, exploding EVs, hydrogen, other things. And so if you're an incumbent OEM or if you're an investor, there is not an option to sit on the sideline because I think you'll be left behind. I think with that in mind, Congress passed this summer the Inflation Reduction Act. And Howard, it's a massive bill. We could spend hours and hours and not get any through all, but let me just mention a few things that I think are significant. You'll see probably the most covered in the media would be the $7,500 tax credit for consumers for buying EVs. And it's really interesting. It's a carrot and sticks phenomenon. It's a carrot, you get a tax credit, but there's a lot more conditions on this tax credit than previously. Previously, there was a limit on how many cars you could produce. You get the credit, and then you got the credit as long as it was a qualifying EV vehicle. Now, Congress has taken the $7,500 tax credit, and they're saying two things. Half of it, you have to have your battery components made in the U.S., and then the other half of it, you're saying, so that's half of that credit. The other half, what they're saying is that the strategic minerals have to be obtained in the U.S. Or I should say, it's not just the U.S. It's U.S. or 12 free trade partners. So South Korea would be an example. So that is a massive shift in the incentives, and it's really a radical departure from, I think, typical U.S. laws, and that it's subsidizing U.S. manufacturing. Importantly, there's a clock on this. So these incentives, the conditions for the tax credit change year over year to make it more stringent, to push components like electrodes to be made in the U.S. and to have or free trade partners, and similarly to have incentives for mining in the U.S. The other large piece of legislation that could influence investment decisions is what's called the 45X tax credit, which is a manufacturing tax credit that applies to, among other things, batteries, production of batteries. And here, I mentioned the consumer tax credit, $7,500. This tax credit for making the batteries, it does not apply to free trade partners. It's only in the U.S. It's $35 a kilowatt hour, and then you can get an additional $10 for battery modules. So if you add those up, and with some other credits available, it could make the batteries, and there's market news about this, more cost competitive than other markets like China that could be subject to tariffs and other things. So if you take these two ends together, the consumer tax credit and then the manufacturer tax credit, these are large financial incentives. And one really important thing about the manufacturer tax credit as well is these are direct pay credits and they're transferable. So you could, in fact, there's talk in the literature about having a secondary market in these tax credits. And I know we have recently added Guy Zeifman in New York and others in our tax practice. So this could be something that's increasingly important, particularly with the Inflation Reduction Act introduced an alternative minimum tax. And for purposes of income, these credits don't count.
Wow.
So go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just going to say that this is huge. I mean, this is one of the things that I think is really important in differentiating auto and mobility, because companies, they just have more access to more capital and non-dilutive too. I mean, that's what every startup wants, and I think that's reason to get investors really excited. And we're already seeing this. I mean, I think you see companies that stand to benefit from the IRA being more appealing in the market. We just did a deal. We represented Fifth Wall and around for Ascend Elements, which is a battery recycler, and there's an incredible amount of excitement around this company. And I think that was partly due to this opportunity that a company like that has in front of them now.
Yeah, and it's just starting, right? So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I would add that the Inflation Reduction Act comes on top of, or stacks on top of, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And that statute actually had a number of grants and loans from the Department of Energy, billions. There's now billions more under the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're helping clients try to access that additional pool of capital. So the pool of capital is not just tax credits that you could transfer, it's also grants and loans. There was a Wall Street Journal article about a DOE conference on this panoply or array of loans in Pittsburgh, and it said people literally could not fit in the rooms. There were so many people there. And because these statutes have clocks on them, you have to deploy the capital within the next 10 years, and there's milestones. If you're not racing toward that, or at least analyzing it, there's a risk you get left behind, and then you're just not cost competitive compared to your peers.
So Justin, before this act and before these crises hit us, there were lots of statistics out there that showed that China was either 90% of the world's battery market or 80%, and also they produced 100% of the natural graphite and 90% of the artificial graphite. I mean, they're huge numbers. So everybody was trying to do a deal with China, trying to lock down a supply of batteries from China, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to produce EVs. So is all of this going to change that, and how quickly, if so?
Yeah, those are great questions, Howard. So will it change it? I think the jury is still out, but you'd have to say, given the market activity that's public and things that we understand are happening behind the scenes, that yes, you will see a push to mine more of the critical elements that go into the battery in the U.S. The statistic I've heard is China controls 85 to 90% of the metals and minerals that go into a battery. From a national security perspective, that is not good. It's good to have energy diversity in our country. So I think just based on what we're seeing, and we're obviously a leading indicator in terms of third-party support services for projects and investment ideas, I think you will see a push to do this. And then ultimately the question will be, given these incentives and these various statutes, particularly Inflation Reduction Act, will it make a material difference and allow market to flourish over here? I think there's a pretty good bet to be made that it will happen, but it involves a lot of factors in the market beyond whether Congress is providing funding.
Yeah, so I'm guessing that people are going to hedge their bets. They're going to try to do both, right? I mean, they can't afford not to lock down some supply internationally, but also they're going to try to do some domestic production as well.
Right, and one of the impediments we have over here is it takes a while to build and permit. Take, for example, a chemical plant to support batteries. And are we going to be able to, as a society, build those, permit them, and get them up and running, or a mine in a way that meets the deadlines in the statute? The other risk I think you've got with any legal regime is the risk that it gets repealed. And this has happened repeatedly in the solar industry and in the wind turbine industry, where production tax credits expire. I think for the most part, they've been extended. But if your business is looking to make an investment in here and obtain capital, I think that's one factor you also have to look at. Is there a risk that there's a change in administration and someone gets rid of this stuff. I'd say the safe bet is that won't happen, but it's certainly something I think clients are thinking about.
All right. So apart from EVs and batteries, Justin, what else do these acts do to help the automobility sector? For example, our event, as you know, does cover aviation, does cover green fuels. What else might this set of acts do?
Right. This could be an aviation game changer for sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. I think Sidley, with partners, Kevin Lewis, Sandy Knox, and a number of others work with United on one of the first SAF deals. I think there's been deals with Neste that we are aware of. And essentially what it does is it creates two buckets of capital funds for SAF. The first is hundreds of millions of dollars for projects over the next 5 years to support the production, transportation, and blending for sustainable aviation fuel. And then there is a credit for $1.25 a gallon for blending a sustainable aviation fuel, and the blend has to meet certain greenhouse gas or climate change targets compared to conventional fuels. Think about a 50% reduction. So those are two large incentives that we think are going to drive investment in sustainable aviation fuel. And I think certainly we're seeing an uptake in interest in that work from players that we know of. And I think it's reasonable to say we'll have some new startups and venture money looking at that sector in order to grow it.
And I suppose another spur to this whole trend is simply that although we were just, quote, facing climate change pressures before the Ukraine war has now made it even more imperative that things happen more quickly, and we move towards a non-carbon economy. And while there's going to be a downturn because of the Ukraine war, and because Europe is going to be strapped for energy, I mean the world is going to be strapped for energy for a while. But it means that things are going to happen more quickly, which also presumably means that investments are going to happen more quickly. Yes, Pa?
Right. So I think you'll see a trend toward investment in these new technologies. But I also think that you will see, and the Inflation Reduction Act provides investment in fossil fuels. I think the reality is Russia cutting off gas to Europe indicated that while we're still reliant on oil and gas, we need to be able to conduct our business here and in the EU without being held hostage to people who invade other countries. So I think that is one thing, we're not even getting into because it's outside of the automobility sector, but there are other credits for things like carbon capture and storage and other things to facilitate us being able to support our allies and friends and not necessarily having to rely on things from Russia. But to your point, I think global instability points toward the need for energy balance and to be able to pull these levers.
Right. So one question I have for Justin is just practically speaking, because a lot of our audience is startups and VCs who sit on startup boards. Is how do we get companies to actually tap this at a practical level? Because what I often hear from clients, especially at the early stages, is, it's overwhelming to start to think about dealing with legislation like this. They think maybe programs like this are really for later stage mature companies that have policy people on the payroll. How do you respond to that? And how can founders take advantage of this, and how can VCs advise their portfolio companies to take advantage of this?
I think that's a great question, because you think of hiring a lawyer and you think it may just be a series of long, boring dissertations of law, perhaps a long legal memo. But how does this work on the ground? How do you get access to non-dilutive capital through these? And I think there's a couple different ways, and it's not just me. We have other terrific partners like Tara Higgins and Haiga Zafman, who I think I mentioned, but it's a couple different things. First of all, I think and there's other law firms as well, but law firms, but particularly Sidley, the strong regulatory bench, since we understand the regulations around these grant and loan programs, around these tax credits. And so we're able to advise, how do you position yourself? And then to do that, and it can be everything from how to do the application, or in some cases we're not the right fit, so we'll put clients or prospective clients in touch with consultants. Second, we understand the regulators and the relationships that we have with them and what their expectations are, particularly on the grant and loan side program from the Department of Energy. So how do we, for example, help a client who might be interested in a battery factory or a chemical plant apply for those? What are the rules of the road, particularly the unwritten rules? And then I think that, the third way we can help clients is just being aware of, particularly in the automobility space, and without revealing confidence, is kind of the trends that are becoming apparent and what other folks, what we see out in the market and how they can really plug in both at a federal level to these different agencies, because it's not just EPA, which you might think of as climate change. There is an EPA component to this. We haven't talked about a standard setting component, but there's also the Department of Energy, Treasury, and other agencies. So how do you plug into that? How do you position yourself? And I think, and Howard may agree or disagree, that auto mobility is a space where it really helps to do repeat work for many clients, because then you understand what's going on in the broader market. It's pretty rare if you don't do auto mobility work to be brought in, because you're just not as close as to what the needs of the business are, and then these macro trends.
Absolutely.
And then one more question. Sorry, Howard.
Go ahead.
In terms of dollars, the other thing that I hear from startups is they sometimes have the impression that it's not going to be a meaningful amount of money that they're going to get from programs like this, not enough to move the needle if they have the ability to go raise a lot of money in a relatively short period of time in the private markets. So how do we respond to clients that say, this isn't going to be worth my time? Because, aside from the fact that this capital is non-dilutive, which is amazing, is it going to be a material amount, you think, for startups?
I do. So if you take the 45X tax credit that we talked about for making batteries in the US, it can be up to $45 per kilowatt hour. And if you do run the numbers, and consultants have wonderful pieces on this, that drives your cost down below where China is, I think even outside of tariffs. So I understand it. You're dealing with the government. This is really a place where entrepreneurship and free enterprise thrives, and so it may seem a little weird that you would do this, but I think it's tremendous value. And again, if you dismiss it out of hand, but your competitors or a significant number of competitors are dipping into this capital, you may not have a business in 5 years, because if you're way below your production cost in China, for example, and you haven't done this, it may be too late. And that's really a key thing. The U.S. Treasury just announced, I think it was last week, that they're going to request information on some of these tax credits for EVs, with clients asking about that. If you're not engaged with these regulators who sit in my town of DC and trying to understand where they are, providing them information, working with them, there's the chance not only you could be left behind, but that your competitors could shape these laws, because some of these terms are undefined. Like, what does processing mean for minerals, for the mineral tax credit? Well, if you're not engaged, your competitors may be, and you may see a wall erected that serves as a major impediment for you being able to grow your business or even survive.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Justin. I guess everybody's going to have to start getting used to the fact we have a very significant national industrial policy, which we didn't before, right? We didn't think that way before, but now we do. So it's a new world. Well, we're running out of time. Do you guys have any last closing statements before we call it a day, and then see you guys in Bonnie Doon in a couple of weeks?
I think personally, I'm optimistic on auto and mobility. I think, based on a few of the things we talked about here today, I think this space is gonna perform better than others over the next 12 to 18 months. For all the reasons we mentioned, the ones that we hadn't gotten to, the fact that there's more corporate venture and more capital from less price sensitive investors in this space. CVCs themselves are funding venture funds. So a lot of that dry powder has, OEMs as LPs standing behind them, that they're looking to to get to work in this space, because like Justin mentioned earlier, not innovating is not really an option for the incumbent companies in the space. So I think there are lots of reasons to be excited over the next 12 to 18 months and beyond.
Excellent. All right, well, this is great. I think this is a great update. Look forward to hosting both of you in Bonnie Doon. Thank you, Justin and Andrew. And we will talk soon.
Thank you, Howard.
Thanks, Howard.
Great talk.